2 weeks ago, we got to beta test the new weapons that will release early next year as part of the Secrets of the Obscure expansion. This is one of the expansion's major features, and while I don't fully subscribe to ArenaNet's promise that these weapons are going to keep theory crafters busy, I do think that there's some interesting weapons in this beta that have a good chance of getting used, or at least might get used, with a few small changes and improvements. Before we get into what those weapons are, let's talk about our evaluation criteria. I've never really liked tier lists, or giving things a flat good or bad score, so instead, we're going to talk about 4 different elements of each of these weapons. First, is the profession that would use this weapon good? Does it currently have a role in the world versus world meta? Second, is the weapon itself good? Does it contribute to the role that its profession plays in world versus world? And are the abilities that the weapon has powerful independently? Third, is the weapon fun to use? Or is it held back by its design or mechanics? Does it pass the vibe check? And fourth, if the above criteria aren't true, what changes would need to be made for that weapon to be usable in world versus world squads? In this video, we'll be covering all 9 professions, but if there's one in particular that you're interested in, I've added chapter markers for each one, and I'd encourage you to navigate to the profession that you're interested in. And of course, if this is your first time here, we're going to generally be talking about these weapons in the context of organized groups and squads in world versus world, rather than roaming, dueling, or PvE. It's not where my experience is, so I'm not the person to talk about those different elements of gameplay. Anyway, without further ado, let's jump in with light classes, starting with Elementalist. Elementalist's weapon is the Mainhand pistol, and each of the 3 previewed skills have a split ability. If you don't currently have a bullet, you gain one when you use the skill, and if you do currently have a bullet, you consume it to gain an additional effect. Starting with if the profession is currently good, yeah, I would say it is. Tempest is starting to fall out of favor with some groups, especially in the EU region, but it's still a powerful support profession for cleanses, heals, and its aura share utility, while Weaver and Catalyst are uncommon but decent damage options for organized groups. Second, is the weapon itself good? Some of the effects that you get when you have a bullet are pretty strong. Water 3 is a relatively unique effect, and the bullet half of Fire 3 does generate a fire aura, but very few of the weapon abilities are support oriented, and for Tempest in particular, I don't think Pistol has any transmutes at all. So I don't think Pistol is good enough to replace any of Support Tempest's weapons, nor will it likely be good enough to replace Staff for DPS Weaver. Third, is the weapon fun to use? I had fun with it. I like that your 2 and your 3 skills both create bullets, so if you need to cast the back half of a bullet effect, you can get it immediately, but you have to burn another skill in order to do it, and you can't cast both back halves in quick succession. I also like that you can stock bullets during downtime, like when you're attacking gates or siege, so that you can prepare them ahead of the fight and use the back half of those skills earlier on. So what would need to change for Pistol to get it used in world versus world groups? Well, it's not a support weapon, pretty clearly, but Elementalist is primarily a support role currently, with a few people playing Staff Weaver or different types of Catalyst for damage. And in a lot of ways, that's okay. Not every weapon has to be viable for world versus world. So I don't think there's much about the weapon that really needs to change here. If anything, it might be something that Elementalists end up using as a result of other balance changes to the profession that make things like Staff for damage on Weaver less viable. Mesmer's weapon is the rifle, and unlike Elementalist pistol, it's clearly a support weapon, offering healing, defensive boons, and condition removal, all on a ranged weapon. Is the profession that uses the weapon currently good? Absolutely. Necromancer has been a staple profession in world versus world for some time now, with great boon removal capabilities, coupled with strong crowd control, and the recent balance patch on November 28th has also improved Necromancer's ability to serve as a per-party boon support profession, competing with Firebrand. Second, is the weapon itself good? Sort of. The front half of Rifle 5 is the most powerful skill in the kit, I think, giving barrier and resistance, and Rifle 3 is also pretty good as a ranged condition removal skill. Pre-combat, you may want to let that effect expire to stack Fury and Might for your first spike, but in combat, you'll always want to detonate it early for the condition cleanse. Many of Rifle's other skills though, the auto attack chain in particular, are held back as a result of being projectile based. World vs. World has a plethora of projectile destruction or reflection skills, which makes anything that's a projectile inconsistent in its application. And Necromancer also has powerful other weapon options, like Staff or Sword Focus. As a result, there's quite a bit of competition for Necromancer in terms of its support weapons. I asked Zik, one of K&T's officers, what he thought about Rifle as a weapon for support Chronomancer to use compared to its other options, and he had this to say.
No, I mean, like, it's really open. Like, Staff, people are taking because of the Chaos Armor, and then, yeah, basically the Chaos Armor. Like, that and the 2 clone generations are pretty easy because they're low cooldown. But, like, you run whatever you want. You can run Focus, you can run Shield for more personal defense. I mean, really, the whole point of the new build is to give boons. Like, you're not really a healer. You go into healing because it makes sense with boon duration. But like you're going for more like 100% boon duration than max healing power. So you the healing is just kind of a little bit extra to help out.
Third, is the weapon fun to use? Again, sort of. It has a lot of versatility, and range support skills in general are very powerful and feel good to use. Personally though, I found the amount of time that you have to make important decisions to be very fast. 2 seconds on Rifle 3 to know if you want to give boons or cleanse allies is pretty quick thinking, and the timing for moving to a good spot and then opening a portal on the back half of Rifle 5 is similarly very fast. In practice, I ended up double casting Rifle 3 pretty much all the time, which just kinda made it feel like a clunky condition cleanse. But that could be an issue with my own reaction times, rather than about the weapon itself. Last, what would need to change for Rifle to be good in World vs. World? I actually think it's already there. Boonstrip Chronomancers aren't going to want to use it over Sword Focus and Greatsword, but Rifle does offer a number of powerful skills for support and boon-oriented Chronomancers to use, especially in terms of generating Chaos Armor, as that build continues to develop. Finishing our light armor professions, Necromancer gains access to both mainhand and offhand swords in the beta. Each skill has a front half and a back half, with the back half activation offering a more powerful version of the front half effect at the cost of some of your health. So is the profession that uses the weapon currently good? Absolutely. It always has been. I think Necromancer and Guardian are 2 of the professions that have been used in World vs. World groups, basically since the start of the game. But is the weapon itself good? It's really close, but I don't think it quite gets there. Having any kind of boon corrupt in the current World vs. World meta is very strong, and that's the main draw of Sword as your main hand, in my view. But like with Mesmer, the auto attack chain is a projectile for some reason, and any kind of projectile reflect or destruct negates your damage output. On the offhand weapon, your Sword 4, you apply a lot of vulnerability, which does help with your group's damage application. Sword 5 also suffers from being a projectile, despite having a relatively strong crowd control effect in its fear application. Is the weapon fun to use? Also yes. I know some people didn't like how slow the leaps were, but I did like that they felt impactful. Most Necromancer specializations struggle with mobility, and that's one of the things that people liked when they were using Mainhand Sword.
I mean, you get a non-targeted leap, right? That's non-targeted, right?
Yeah,
Neither of them are targeted.
That's a weapon-based, non-targeted leap on a class that has none. It can be really good for any Necro build, any comp, maybe. Just the fact that I'll have a leap of your own. It's new. It's something the class has never had.
I also liked that you had to commit to the back half of most of the abilities to get the stronger of the 2 weapon effects, like the Corrupt being on Sword 3 and the Fear on Sword 5. But that said, there are some things that could be improved to make the weapon a bit more fun and interesting to use.
I didn't like how the first and the second one did the same thing. I didn't like that about the sword.
For the leap specifically, or for all the skills?
No, for the skills, like how they had a flip over and it kind of did the same thing. I didn't like that.
So what would need to change for mainhand and offhand sword to be good in World vs. World? Well, you're going to see a theme in this video, where there's 2 camps that a profession falls into. They have a good beta weapon, but their existing options are better, or they have an average beta weapon, but their existing options are pretty bad. I would put Necromancer into the first category, where Sword is pretty good, but Necro also has a lot of good weapons. I think the Sword as an offhand might be fine as is, though a bit more control over the trajectory of the Fear Orb would really improve the weapon in my estimation. Either making the orb a ground-placed skill, and having the back half detonated in place, or recall the orb back to you, fearing people it passes through, would both improve it considerably. The Mainhand Sword, on the other hand, I think just needs a little extra bit of tuning to make it better than an option like Axe. If the auto attack chain weren't a projectile, or if the 3-skill corrupted more boons, either by adding an extra corrupt on the back half, or reducing the cooldown of the skill overall, I think it would be a good enough option. Necroswords also suffer from the same issues that Mesmer Rifle has, where the window to use those skill reactivations is very narrow, as Yumi also pointed out.
Just skill 2 and skill 5 felt like there was not enough time between firing the skill and the reactivation time. Like there wasn't enough leeway.
Moving on to medium armor professions, each of Engineer's shortbow skills has a small effect, which also leaves behind a field on the ground. The back half of any of the abilities detonates, with detonations chaining together for a more powerful effect if the fields overlap. So first, is Engineer currently good? Not really, but it has been good somewhat recently, and I don't think it's too far out of the meta to come back into it. A good weapon set is something that could improve Scrapper as a support option for world versus world groups, though I think Shortbow's unlikely to do that, or do anything for DPS Engineer builds by itself. Second, is the weapon itself good? The weapon itself, I think, might be the most polarizing weapon that we saw in the preview. And a lot of that comes from Shortbow being a pretty complicated weapon, with a high skill floor, and a use case that depends on both a player's skill and a commander who's able to play around it. In a situation where the player using the Shortbow is good, and the commander can do that, I think it's actually a very good weapon on its own. And it's also helped by the fact that Engineer's existing weapons don't have great support abilities. Since Engineer spends most of its time in kits for world versus world groups, Shortbow doesn't need to be very good to be the weapon that it will want to use anyway, and I think it definitely clears that bar. Third, is the weapon fun to use? Personally, I think that the predictive element of knowing when you needed to place arrows in advance so that you could detonate them when needed was really challenging, but also rewarding when you got it right. Granted, I didn't get to play Engineer very much, but I did like that the front half of each arrow still had a reasonable effect on it, and that stringing the cast together and then deciding which arrow needed to start the detonation to get additional effects rewarded that ability to plan and think ahead about where your group would be a couple seconds from now. In practice though, it does feel a bit clunky to use. So what needs to change for Shortbow to be good in world versus world? I think it's there, but I think it's there mostly because Engineer's other options aren't great. So if we're going to talk about how Shortbow could be improved in general,
it feels kind of clunky right now. Like when you want to spam down a arrow stack and detonate them all, the cast times are really long. It definitely feels like it was designed with permanent quickness in mind. So I feel like, especially since this very much feels like a world versus world oriented weapon, that the biggest thing you could do to help it and make it feel a lot less clunky would be to knock the cast time down from half second to a quarter second.
It's still really difficult to evaluate a weapon with a high skill floor, because the amount of time that I spent with the weapon was definitely not enough to get good at it. In fact, it's hard for 1 week to be enough time to get to know any of the weapons in the beta.
I'll say one thing about basically all the weapons without even having to test them, and is that a week is not long enough for a majority of people to get a good feel for a weapon, especially when you're in World v World where content varies from week to week and night to night.
Moving on to Ranger, which received both mainhand and offhand mace in the beta, with each weapon providing a stacking effect on any skill use. This effect is eventually consumed with enough stacks, increasing both your outgoing damage and your outgoing healing for 5 seconds. First, is Ranger currently good? I would say yeah. Druid's one of the stronger off-support options in a party to take care of healing and condition cleanse, and while Ranger isn't exactly meta for groups for damage, it is a very popular cloud profession and also a roaming profession. Second, is the weapon itself good? Not only do I think that Mace is good in general, but it also has flexible abilities that synergize well with both offensive and defensive roles. For support, the end of the auto attack chain shares Vigor, Mace 2 has a heal, Mace 3 shares protection, and Mace 3 as well as Mace 5 are both hard crowd control effects. Is the weapon set fun to use? It's going to depend on how much you like melee, but I think it is. Mace does benefit significantly from having quickness, as the cast time on all of these abilities is quite long, but it's a versatile weapon kit. I like professions that are dedicated support, but also have a little bit of crowd control effects that let you contribute to your squad's offense, like Firebrand Staff 5, The Line, or Dagger Tempest's air transmutes for stuns, and Mace has some similar effects with Mace 3 and Mace 5 that let you do a little bit of offense even as a dedicated support profession. In addition, the stacking effect applied by the weapons, Force of Nature, is good enough that you may not even need to use offhand Mace, which opens up some interesting build diversity.
I was using Mace Warhorn and then Staff, either because you'd use an energy sigil or some other, on swap sigil, or just different mechanic was cool. It also was really nice with the new relic of Caracosa, because of the fact that it adds more blasts to the kit. You get a blast on 3 as well as a blast on your Warhorn 5. So I think as far as powerful things go, it makes the build work better in the current meta and state that it's in.
So finally, what would need to change for Mace to be viable for World versus World? I actually think it's there. I think this is one of the stronger weapons that we saw, and Ranger, in particular support Druid, has virtually no other support option besides Staff, so it's really not a particularly high bar to clear in order to get used in organized groups. Last, for medium armor professions, we have Thief. Thief gets a Mainhand Axe for the expanded Weaponmaster system. You throw your axe, it leaves more axes on the ground, and then you can pull those axes back to you with your 3 skill, which grants the extra effects. First, is the profession that uses the weapon currently good? No. Second, is the weapon itself good? No. It might be good for roaming or in structured PvP, but I don't really know anything about those modes, so I'm not qualified to answer that question. Also, for some reason, the axes are projectiles, and that's definitely not going to help. Third, is the weapon fun to use? Yeah, it seems fun. I actually think that the way that Thief Mainhand Axe works is the way that Necro Sword 5 should work with the Fear Orb, where it leaves something behind on the ground and then you can recall it back to you for an extra effect. I think that mechanic is actually very fun. Finally, what needs to change for Axe to be good in World vs. World? Look, we had this conversation about Elementalist Pistol. Not every weapon that's previewed in this Weaponmaster beta needs to be viable for World vs. World groups. It would be nice if Thief eventually had a build that was usable for World vs. World mods, because with Druid's buffs, it really is the odd profession out in terms of what's usable in an organized context, but Mainhand Axe is not going to be what pulls it out of obscurity and back into the meta. Last, we'll cover the heavy professions, starting with Revenant. Revenant's weapon is Mainhand Scepter, which has a 3 skill with an ally targeting mode and barrier on its auto attacks. Sort of like Ranger, it also receives a stacking effect for using these auto attacks, which makes the 3 skill more powerful when you use it. So is Scepter itself good? I think so. All 3 skills grant barrier, which is a popular support mechanic these days, and Scepter 3 is a versatile skill that has both offensive and defensive applications, and it's easy to switch which one you're using on the fly. A lot of discussions around Scepter, from what I've seen, have been around building up auto attack charges, but in practice I don't think this should be a huge issue, as you can auto attack gates, siege, or ambient creatures to build up charges before a fight, similar to how Berserker can get itself into combat early in order to build up adrenaline. Third, is the weapon fun to use? I didn't hate it, but I also do have a pretty strong bias against ally targeting effects. I think Revenant Scepter 3 is actually one of the less offensive instances of ally targeting that I've seen, but it does still feel a bit weird to try and use in the middle of combat. I also think that the range restriction on Scepter as a melee weapon makes it a little difficult to build charges in many cases when you don't have the opportunity to pre-stack. Something like 600 range or even 900 range may be more appropriate, just to make sure that you can utilize the abilities on Scepter 3 more regularly. Last, what would need to change for Scepter to be viable for World vs. World? In case you haven't noticed yet, the theme for this question, in the case of professions that are already in the meta, is what other weapons is the new weapon competing with? And in this case, the only one of Revenant's weapons that's already support-oriented is Staff. Now I know that Vindicator primarily uses Mace right now as a support weapon, but the only reason that Mace is so popular right now is because of how many blasts it has for synergies with Relic of Caracosa. And once that changes, I think there's a lot of options that become interesting.
Legitimately, like Staff as a support weapon on Rev is phenomenal. It's such a great weapon. The 5 is still one of the best CCs out there, though a little wonky in PvP, but still really good. So I suspect Rev will probably stay Mace, Shield, and Staff until Caracosa is dead.
For Warrior, Staff is a jack-of-all-trades weapon, with a bit of movement utility, a pull, and attacks that heal and buff allies while damaging enemies at the same time. The profession that uses the weapon is currently very good. Berserker is the top damage choice for most groups right now, and while Spellbreaker has mostly fallen out of the meta, I do still think it's a relatively strong profession to use as 1 or 2 people in a larger squad. The weapon itself is also very good. It's a versatile weapon that has flexible offensive and defensive skills, and I think it's about on par with Ranger Mace for one of the stronger weapons that we saw in the preview. Unfortunately, Warrior has a lot of good weapons, and so there's quite a bit of competition if Staff is going to be something that sees regular use. Is the weapon fun to use? I had almost as much fun playing Staff Warrior as I did playing Sword Necro, and I've been a Necromancer main for years. It's very fun. The pull is fun, the movement skill is fun, the allied targeting on Staff 3 is not particularly fun, but it is interesting that you can stack the unblockable charges that it gives onto a single player, so maybe there's something interesting you could do with that in smaller scale groups. When Staff is out for real, I will almost certainly command with it. I do think it's a great weapon in general, and I'm looking forward to using it personally. So what needs to change for Staff to be viable for World vs. World? Well, as with Ranger, I think it's already there, but the difference is that Warrior has much better weapons than Ranger does. The more interesting question in my mind is whether it's good enough to push a class like Support Spellbreaker back into the meta, which I don't think it quite is, but I could be wrong. And even though the burst skills do have healing on them for Berserker, some people think that it may be a serviceable damage weapon. If there were changes made, however, modifying the boons that are given by Staff 5s seems like it would probably be a good place to start, as this weapon skill is slightly less powerful than other things that we saw in the kit.
I don't know how I feel about the resolution boon, to be honest, because do we really need more resolution for World vs. World? Like, the meta is not Condi focused. Instead, what I would put instead would be personally resistance. My fanboy in me is telling me to give it regen, stability, and swiftness. The reason why I say that is because those are the old banner skills. If you picked up the banner of tactics, you get regen. If you picked up the elite banner, you could give stability and swiftness. That was fun, spamming that.
Closing with Guardian for this video, they get mainhand and offhand pistols, projectile-based weapons that apply large amounts of burning at range. Guardian's representation, both for damage and support, is probably the best out of any profession in World vs. World right now, and they are very well positioned to take advantage of any weapon as far as comp representation goes. But is the weapon itself good? Absolutely not. And again, there's the caveat here that we're talking about groups, we're not talking about roaming, we're not talking about dueling, we're not talking about PvE or structured PvP. It's a condition weapon that applies projectiles. And for World vs. World groups, that's two separate bad qualities that you want to avoid rolled into one weapon. It seems like maybe it might be good for some of these smaller scales. I did spend some time attacking a golem with it, and you can definitely stack a lot of burning. But as far as whether the weapon's fun to use or not, I don't think projectiles are inherently fun in World vs. World because it's so much harder to pick your opportunities to use them and not get your damage blanked by projectile reflex or projectile destruction. And overall, the entire weapon set just kind of felt uninteresting to me. All of the abilities kind of do the same thing. They shoot at an enemy, and the enemy gets conditions, usually burning. Guardian pistols didn't get a standout weapon mechanic like other professions did, like Ranger or Engineer. In fact, they didn't even get flip abilities, like Necromancer or Ranger. So what would need to change for pistol to be viable in World vs. World groups? Well, put this one in the same category as Thief and Elementalist. Guardian has a lot of strong weapon options already, both for support and damage specializations, so it's okay that pistol's probably not going to be very good in these contexts. Not everything needs to be viable here, and even if it was, Guardian's existing weapon options are so good that pistol would have a very high bar to clear to see use above something like Mace for support or Scepter for damage. So that's all 9 professions covered. In my opinion, there's some different categories that we can put each profession into as a result of this beta. There's 2 professions that have a good shot of using these weapons when they release with the abilities as is, no changes needed. Those are Ranger and Engineer. With minor changes in buffs, or nerf to other weapons or relics, I think Mesmer, Necromancer, Warrior, and Revenant will all probably want to use their new weapons as well, or those weapons will at least be competitive with existing options. For Elementalist and Guardian, their weapons look pretty underwhelming, but the profession does already have access to other good weapon options. And of course for Thief, there's larger changes that need to take place in order for the profession to have any kind of role in an organized World vs. World group. A big thank you in this video to everyone who provided feedback and discussion. It's been a long-term goal of mine to include voices and perspectives other than my own in the videos that I make, and I'm grateful for everyone who is willing to provide that. And if you would have liked to be included yourself, or know somebody else who should have been, you should join my Discord so that you can let me know. Link is in the video description. Otherwise, leave a comment if you think there's something important that I missed about any of these weapons, and we can keep the conversation going down there. And finally, if you want to get my live reactions to different betas and changes as they come out for the game, I stream on Twitch on Friday, Tuesday, and Wednesday at 9 PM Eastern, so you can find me over there and you can see what I think. But until then, I've been Chef, and enjoy the rest of your day.